Right, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to you all again, and welcome to our next Creative Cities conversation. My name is Dave Charnley. I'm the Senior Urban Designer here at Palmerston North City Council. So like other cities, Palmerston North is not immune to many of the current urban mobility challenges that cities face. How we move, how we dwell is critical to human, economic and environmental health of our cities. Over the last 150 years, our obsession with time and speed, as well as a narrow focus on mode choice, has led to some perverse impacts on the goal of making our cities more efficient. Congestion, pollution, severance of built form and communities, a lowering of quality townscape, a lowering of active and visible city life, and higher financial costs. I want to now quickly tell a visual story of a street that you are all no doubt familiar with, Rangatika Street. This is the typical and local real story that demonstrates the negative physical impact on city making and city life when one way of moving is given a high degree of priority and power. This is a story of how motordom over the last 100 years has slowly put the pressure on the most valuable and fragile indicator species of city life. That is the pedestrian. So this is Rangatika Street at the turn of last century, and as you know, we didn't arrive here by motor vehicle. We travelled up the river, it was our main highway, and when the city was surveyed off, our main mode of travel was the railway. And as the settlement of Palmerston North developed, Rangatika Street was set aside, surveyed off, and as you can see there's what looks to be like a bit of a mud track through the middle and quite a lot of space that I presume would have been used for grazing, other uses, as the small prosperous town was starting to establish. Obviously by the turn of the century, the built form was starting to change, people were investing in the city, the buildings were sort of 2-storey, maybe 3-storey. The main mode of moving around, horse and cart, walking. By 1920s, the introduction of the motor car had started to occur, but there's still, plenty of walking around. The built form was starting to change even more as investment in the city was increasing, and people were sort of taking the risk to embed themselves in the city. We had cyclists as well, which you can see to the right in front of that vehicle. By the 1930s, Rangatika Street was quite a hive of commercial activity. Here is a great demonstration of the mixture of use around mode and how people move. So vehicles were obviously starting to take a little bit more prominence. It was seen as something of having sort of affluence to have a motor vehicle. There was plenty of cyclists around, and people were probably walking and just working their way across the street as to where they needed to go. By the 40s, the motor vehicle was probably starting to have more of a dominance in the street. You can see the infrastructure in the street was being established around curbs and channels. The built form was still increasing, and the commercial activity of Rangatika Street was still quite strong. Again, still cyclists. Then came in some of the rules. The rules driven by a pretty well organised motor industry that sort of set rules around more about how the vehicles move at speed and efficiently, and perhaps less for the pedestrian being told where to walk, where to cross, how to negotiate. By the 1960s, probably really heavily dominated by vehicles. You can see that the infrastructure of the streets changed. There's road markings, there's signs. The rules are being, put down and being made more blatant and obvious. And cyclists still wanting to move by their choice and perhaps feeling they're starting to get a wee bit crowded out. Pedestrianism was still strong. The retail experience of the city was still about visiting the shops and the individual shop owners who probably provided 1 or 2 or 3 services, not sort of one under a big large format retail experience. Parking meters were obviously present, revenue was being generated, and cycling was still present using the parking meters as bike parks. You can sort of see though that the view of the street had changed. You couldn't really see past beyond the car line of parking along the edges. So, at one stage this was quite an active, busy street. By the 60s, cars were really starting to dominate. The street was just marked out for speed, wide, fast, and the city life, the edge conditions, the people on the streets were really starting to disappear and more be present in the vehicles. And this is 2020. This is where we're at. The built forms increased. The road markings have got wider. The city life really isn't there. The quality of the buildings are starting to go backwards. So really it poses a challenge to us. How do we address this situation going forward? So it's all really important that we move and connect in a manner that supports growth and prosperity. And one way of doing this is to consider the concept of slowing our city, reintroducing the human scale experience and moving and connecting to improve the health of our city. Crucial to this is the transfer of mobility from private motor vehicle to other slower modes, particularly walking, cycling and PT, as this new street change does demonstrate that we're starting to get all of those modes back into these spaces. It challenges the conventional wisdom of creating a strong economy first, so increased population and quality of life follows. It now seems that creating a higher quality of life through good urban design is an obvious first step to attracting new residents, investments and jobs. And a key recommendation Charles Landry made in his 2013 Creative Cities report. Careful and considered application on all levels of how we move, connect, dwell and experience the city and each other will surely result in the right kind of human habitat, a higher degree of urban quality, vibrancy and vitality. And this leads me to introducing our guest speaker. Liz is New Zealand Advisory Services Leader for ARUP and has over 18 years experience in land use and transport integration, urban design, regeneration, sustainability and city systems. Liz's experience comes from working across New Zealand, Australia, London and Europe, developing roads and streets frameworks and providing social, economic and cultural outcomes for both strategy and design. Liz brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in applying both top-down and bottom-up urbanism. Liz has worked on the transport-orientated developments of King's Cross, St Pancras and Euston stations, and is responsible for numerous other roles, including London's Streetscape Design Manual, leading the Urban Design Review Panel of London, funding of urban design, strategic walk networks, and Making Walking Count program. Liz also ran innovation precincts while in London, where she was able to trial many things, including tactical urbanism, car sharing, cycle hire, differential parking charges, and working and looking into electric and hydrogen refuelling infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Palmy welcome as we invite Liz to the stage to present Movement in Place.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, kia ora. So I am Liz Halsted. I'll just move this around the right way. Just in terms of Palmy street cred, I spent a couple of years doing my masters here at Massey, biking to work. We did a bit of a bike ride around today, and I said that I used to bike through the Esplanade on the way to university and to get chased a few times by some of the friendly locals, but I understand that those issues have been resolved now with the great new cycleways that we've got. But today I'm going to talk about the role of transport, things that transport can solve and also create in terms of problems, bringing place back into cities, how we can deliver more good and less bad, and then 10 actions to take potentially for Palmerston North in terms of trying to see how we can move forward. So, as was mentioned by Dave, since history's begun, people have chosen to travel, and you can see the complexity has increased over time. It makes it really exciting, and it's a critical it's a critical thing for people to do, not just for goods and services and getting it from A to B, but to connect with other people as well. So traditionally, the approach to traffic orientated planning has been a focus on vehicles, because if you can, often the historic approach has been, if you can't measure it, it doesn't count. And so, but gradually over time, things have been rebalanced in terms of priorities to include public transport and walking and cycling as well. But often land use was not linked in, and one of the critical things that people have found has been that land use and transport cannot be looked at in isolation. They've got to be looked at together to really get all the benefits. And here you can see where movement in place and outcome-led design has started to come about. So that all came about actually coming from, dare I say, the beloved Boris Johnson, who looked at it because he realised he couldn't deliver the huge cycling campaign and investment program that he had without actually starting to make some difficult decisions and trying to reprioritise modes, but also looking at land use. And what we're seeing now is that there's now, post-COVID, there's a further shift away from movement in place and to become a much more systemic, looking at safe, healthy and future cities as well and communities. But just moving backwards before we look forwards, is that transport shaped the history of human civilization. It can transform urban economies as well. That's Canary Wharf. And then you can see the change here of some of the transformation. This is Battersea Power Station, where you can see that regeneration can be catalysed. So here is huge housing development, a whole redevelopment of a whole power station. There's also an American embassy with a large moat around it somewhere through there as well, which is quite interesting. That was part of the negotiations. They had to have a moat with security. But it also can create new parts of the city. So this is somewhere close to my heart, which is King's Cross. That's the hotel there, where people used to go to sell drugs there. But then it became a place where there was a partnership between a developer and the council and government. And it was a 30-year vision, and it completely set out a plan for 30 years of how things could change. And it's created whole new parts of the city. So just like what you want to do in Palmy, it's like there's a whole big theme about meet me at St Pancras station, and ideally for you in Palmy, it's about meet me at the square. And that's the sort of transformation, but it's about a long-term view and not just thinking you can do it in 3 years. And it's not necessarily just about scale, it's about having that collective integrated vision. And it can increase your property value as well. It can also just completely revive communities as well and connect people. But like everything, not everything is perfect, and it's not all good news in terms of transport. Transport has created, as you probably know, many problems of its own around the world. Sometimes it's been a victim of its own success. So congestion, you'll see, carbon emissions. It's caused a lot of air pollution around the world. Like Beijing regularly has to shut schools because of the air pollution so bad from the vehicles. It's not smart. Creaking networks, a failure to sweat networks properly, digital disruption. What on earth does this mean? And then often new ideas rejected by people who just want to carry on doing what they've always done. I work with some people, I used to work with some people at both in the UK and in New Zealand who just want to do a traffic model. They just want to do the same old, but actually we've got to look at things a bit differently. Also in terms of transport, things often, the infrastructure, and we've got Sarah Sinclair, the new Chief Infrastructure Officer here, things do need to grow, but sometimes there's not enough funding, so you do need to look at things a bit more differently. So other problems caused by transport, as you can see here, is congestion, severance. Severance is where communities are cut off, and you can see that. The states are really good examples of severance where you just never would be able to cross the road there. And there's some really big challenges. What's quite interesting in Auckland is in the 1950s they had a whole lot of experts over from the States, and I apologise for anyone in the audience from the States, but it was what people knew at the time, and they created quite a lot of this with what they thought was the new way of planning transport. There's also blight as well, where buildings and land uses just get quite damaged by the noise and the pollution right next door to it. And then there's danger. So that is a picture of a roundabout where it has really high killed and seriously injured for mainly pedestrians and cyclists and motorcyclists, but lots of crashes. Pollution, you can see there, that's Paris. Really poor air pollution, and it may be beautiful buildings, you're having a great time, but if you can't breathe, it's not so good. And then deprivation as well. You've got great wealth there, that's Canary Wharf, and then huge poverty as well, and that's all separated through the transport network. And as you know, Palmerston North has its own transport challenges and opportunities. Some of it is historical, as we heard tonight, and as Charles Landry said in 2013, and things are really improving as well, that Palmerston North is a number of traffic engineering projects pulled together. So, but I know with Dave and the team that things have been changing, and with all your tactical urbanism and other projects working through, you're starting to bring place back into Palmy. But as you can see, transport is not just Palmerston North or not just New Zealand's problem, it is a global problem. It's a great picture, I use this quite a lot because it probably speaks about the mood of the nation in the UK at the moment as well, but Boris was a big supporter of biking actually, and but you know, there are still huge transport problems over there, and there are around the world, and there's no one city that has the same as other cities. It's all linked back to your land use, your people as well. So how do we bring place back into our towns, into our cities? So some of the ingredients you need, it all comes back to we've got to look at sustainability, resilience and restoration. So what's interesting around the world at the moment is people talk about sustainability, but now it's all about restoration. It's about this future circular economy and being restorative as well. And some of that, we're lucky in New Zealand with our Indigenous people. With iwi, it's about looking backwards to look forward, and it's about being the kaitiakitanga and the guardians, and I think that's a big move that's happening globally. So people, place and space, economy, culture and leisure, government, and personality. And that's the thing in Palmy, it's about being proud, and I love your magazine that you've got called Proud as well. You know, it's about being proud of where you live. And also one of the things, the Brundtland report was well ahead of its time, you know, talking about sustainable development that meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. At the moment, a lot of transport networks and transport systems around the world are compromising the ability of the future generations, and we need to think about how we can disrupt and change that. And we need to restore that balance. So creating, for example, Palmerston North as a destination, not just for local people but international people as well, but ecologically responsible, and also moderating the dominance of roads and bringing life back into the streets. It's not about being anti-car, but it's about making sure that all the modes are balanced up. We need to celebrate our heritage and ideally create more human-centred design and bringing back health and wellbeing. One thing with COVID was quite interesting was that people got on their bikes and they got walking and cycling and they rediscovered their neighbourhoods, which has been pretty exciting. So the other thing is, as I said, creating that restorative, culturally and socially sustainable places. So focusing not just on the vehicle or not just on the person, but seeing how it all links together as one system. So how do we deliver more good and less bad? So I've got 10 suggestions that you could take. So the first one is about putting outcomes at the heart of design. So actually, instead of just charging into some cool infrastructure project, actually looking at what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve, and are you all joined up in trying to achieve those outcomes? being clear on the outcomes, so having that vision and that integrated approach to strategy. So one of the things that's in terms of really successful cities where they've got a good transport infrastructure and they've had really good transport outcomes, it's not about the size or the money the city has. It's been about the courage of the mayor and the politicians and having a strategic joined up vision, which makes a huge difference in terms of making sure you're delivering what you're doing. So this one here is just the example of the London strategy for transport. It's linked in to their wider London plan, their spatial plan, and to the environmental strategy, and it's all joined up. The KPIs are there, so you can see what you're doing, and there's no surprises. But one thing that you've got to do as well is also make sure that you won't always be able to achieve everything for every person and for every mode. So you do need to make trade-offs, and that is uncomfortable. But sometimes that's what you've got to do. But we do tend to get excited about and favour large capital projects. People just want to build a road, or they just want to build a train tunnel and a train line, and it is very exciting. But sometimes getting caught up in the big capital projects, you forget the small stuff, and you often forget that people's most pressing concerns can be very different. And this can slow down all our road projects, and you would have seen that in Palmerston North. I mean, Wellington, for example, some of the cycleways they've put in, some of the public really spoke up about it, and it wasn't because they were anti-cycling, it was because they probably hadn't been engaged early enough. So it's about how do you communicate as you're trying to make this change and trying to deliver that infrastructure. But starting from outcomes creates that vision, and people can understand why, because half of the time it's about trying to communicate and telling the story to the public and to your stakeholders and to iwi, saying why are you doing it, what are the outcomes, and then that creates that political support, and you can deliver and often harness in the extra funding if you've got the outcomes and understand the why. So the second action I would suggest is about trying to embed progressive measures within large capital programs. So one of the things that is really important at the moment is sustainability, and every city in the world at the moment is looking at different things. Our Climate Change Commission report, which I'll talk about shortly, is out. So at the moment people are feeding back on what the government is saying that they're going to do for climate change. One of the things that we're seeing within our company Arup and also globally around the world is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These are things that are good principles that can help guide you, but set a good framework for where you want to go. One of the other things that's really important is leveraging off other capital programs, and I know that's one of the visions for Palmerston North, about integration, not just integration with people working together, but integration of other programs. So you could see that you end up getting cost benefits because you're actually digging up the same piece of road. You can actually get dual benefits. Today I was biking down Cuba Street, and some of the improvements were triggered through looking at your assets and renewal program and trying to combine it with urban realm improvements, and you can see those great things. But it's all about trying to see how you can leverage. But we do need to look at funding differently. Everyone at the moment in New Zealand is quite obsessed with the better business case and getting public sector funding. There's always different ways, and don't ever just think you haven't got government funding so you won't be able to go ahead. There are always different options. But there's always big pressure on transport to help deliver better local quality of life outcomes. This figure, and this is something that's quite similar around the world, is, you know, transport represents 80+% of our urban public space. When you count up all the roads, you count up all the car parking, that is a lot. So often also prioritising the reuse and rethinking of road space is really critical, and that's what you're starting to do here at the moment. This is a healthy streets framework, which I'll come on to later, but that's quite critical. And that's something that there's a big movement towards. So these are some of the frameworks where this was under Boris, where they started to look at how do we start to reallocate road space. and you don't prioritise one mode over the other. You look at the land use and you start to see that not everything is equal and you need to treat things differently. Melbourne is looking at things, Europe as well. Europe, there's a big movement to look at the urban street as an ecosystem, and they've got a whole lot of European programs looking at different ways about managing movement in place, and now looking at future streets. And then Sydney's had a few challenges, and then they're now moving towards much more balancing, bringing place back into their highways and into their local towns within Sydney. And then Auckland also has got a movement in place framework where they're trying to reallocate road space. So there's no one place that's getting it right, but it's about getting it right for your city. And like you and other cities around New Zealand have got into tactical urbanism, but one of the great things about tactical urbanism, which is these temporary measures, is it can lead and be a trigger towards future design and permanent measures. And we used to use it a lot because when things went politically, when people politically couldn't see how could you do it, we took out traffic lights on one scheme, and we had the media from all around the UK going, it's that we're going to start a craze for taking out traffic lights. But we took traffic lights out in one area and pedestrianised this road in the middle of central London, and it worked quite well. But then you have failures as well, but it's about not being afraid, and then if things work well, you can make them permanent. But one of the other things that is quite critical too, in terms of another lesson or things to think about, is develop the better evidence base on the wider impact of transport. So this here, you've got so many opportunities in Palmerston North at the moment, and your freight hub is just one example. But it's critical that you leverage off what KiwiRail and NZTA are doing and make sure that you are getting the best benefits you can from it. There's a huge way using other development that you can use to unlock things, and this is also what's happening around the world in terms of transport unlocking housing and development. And funding can also be created through the value created by development as well. Other things I know that are topical are parking. And now it is really hard. People love their cars. In New Zealand, we've got one of the highest car ownership rates in the world per head of population. And people just want to come into town and park their car. But actually, when you start looking at these figures, and these are figures taken from Transport for London, but Auckland Transport has been taking regular measures, as have other cities around the world, New York, where they actually see that it's actually pedestrians and cyclists that spend the most, and then people that are travelling by public transport in town centres, which often takes away the myth that you've got to drive to spend the most money. So that's something that is something that data is really critical, so that you can show that evidence base. And then other things that you can look at too is that it's not always the big things that can make a difference. You can do things like road pricing discounts, monitoring and analysis, responsible procurement, things like pollution-eating plants and green walls. All of those things can make a big difference without costing a huge amount of money. But then another thing you need to look at is make technology work for you. It's not about people just saying, hey, I want to think up something, I've got a digital tool, it's cool, why don't you use it? It's about making sure you're using the digital tools and things to actually solve your problems. Fourthly, using and creating burning platforms. And you're like, what does that mean? And basically what I'm saying is use some of the crises now and turn something bad into something really good. So at the moment, climate change is something that's really hot in New Zealand and globally. COP26 is being held in Scotland this year. The government's put out their Climate Change Commission report. This is the time to get some money to Palmerston North, get your decarbonisation plan sorted and actually front foot it and leverage off this next year, because there's going to be a lot of pressure coming through the government and through internationally into New Zealand to see how we can reduce our emissions. And one of the things they're saying in terms of the Climate Change Commission and the government is low-hanging fruit, is transport. So leverage off that, see what funding you can get. Other things that you can leverage off is COVID-19, and I know you guys have been pretty good in getting some of your tactical urbanism and other funding through, but still leverage off that. There are still, unfortunately COVID's not gone away yet, but leverage off things like COVID to try and get more money in here and more things to test and try. Another one here is an example from around the world. This is another London example, but as you can see here, this is about air quality. This was the thing that made the big change in London. That was a big change also in San Francisco and some other places. And that was, if you look here, you can see that nitrogen dioxide is being breached over the World Health Standards in 187 places. And it accounted for 10,000 premature deaths. That was the thing that made the big change. That was the thing that led to Simon Burkett, who's this man here, writing every week to to Transport for London in capitals, and taking us to court to say we've got to make a difference, we've got to make a change. And you think about who are the champions within Palmerston North, who are the people that you can work with who will help to make change. And then you can also get a mobilised community. This was a sit-in about cyclists trying to protest about cycling deaths and not enough money into cycling. So those are some of the things you can do in terms about champions. And then in terms of other things, number 5, include iconic interventions. So this is one of the things that I've noticed about Palmerston North is that you do really good things, but you don't shout about it very much. And like, it's true. And like the green bike scheme, like you've got this scheme, but it also started off with Professor Richard Lee years ago, and that was one of the first, that was the first cycle hire scheme, free scheme in New Zealand and probably in Australasia. But yet you do lots of stuff and you're quite humble, and I think you need to actually start to be a bit more arrogant. Not like Auckland is. I'm from Invercargill, I can say that. But you know, shout about some of the good stuff you're doing. But as I said, about these iconic interventions, they don't have to be massive, but yeah, they can be big or small. But just in terms of other examples, at the moment, there's a big movement on globally about repurposing major roads. So you can see here, this is Paris. They're looking at a whole vision for repurposing the Arc de Triomphe. If anyone has driven around it, you're lucky to be sitting here. I've been in a taxi around it, had to shut my eyes. But you can see Copenhagen. They've repurposed some of the roads, and they've now got amazing streets. It's not everywhere, but it's about in certain places. The same here in Seoul in Korea, where they've repurposed their highways, and they've created sort of an urban sort of lovely urban sort of landscape. And then over in New York, there's a whole lot of different things going on. This is some recent work that we've been involved with about reimagining Brooklyn Bridge, where this is all motorway, and it was a competition with the City Council, and they're actually going to create a whole lot of spaces which was actually dominated just by cars. But even one progressive intervention can change mindset in the city. So this was New York, and tactical urbanism there, where they shut part of Times Square, has made a huge difference to them in quite a road-dominated place. But it also can reboot public decision makers' perceptions of what a city can be. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but I think Palmerston North, this is one thing that I think you're leading the way in New Zealand on, you know, creating temporary infrastructure. But again, you just quietly get on and do it. You need to shout about it a bit more. But it's also, as I mentioned before, it's less controversial to put in temporary interventions, as you found out, and they can often lead to those permanent interventions. And that can include affecting the parking as well, where it's not quite as bad and the shops won't shut around it, and people won't die if you take out that one car park. But it's amazing, in Auckland, they had some of the Auckland Transport had some people having death threats because of them wanting to take out 3 or 4 car parks outside St Heliers in Auckland. So people get very emotionally attached, but sometimes that's where tactical urbanism becomes really helpful. And COVID-19 really helped us along the way with getting a lot of the tactical urbanism projects in around the country. But also the interim use of space reduces resentment of, for example, for years of construction. So one of the things that's happening around the world too, when you're constructing big projects, or even projects that aren't too big, but they're going to take, a year and they're going to be disruptive, you can transform areas in a phased way. For example, turning areas into, this is a local garden, but you can also change them into football pitches and actually let the people reclaim some of that space instead of just having, you need to have places for your diggers and your construction traffic to be, but you also need to look at what else you can do with the spaces so that people don't feel alienated from it as it transforms. 7, design flexible and adaptive infrastructure. So typically we've designed for permanence. We can see that bridge. Obviously you want your bridge to be permanent, but there's a lot of other things where if you can be integrated and smart with your design of your infrastructure, they can become more flexible and adaptable to change, and that can happen across the day. And it can also enable users to be more flexible as well with how things are operated. And it moves towards much more flexible and adaptable designs. So around the world at the moment, a lot of spaces are now becoming modular, and buildings are as well. So you can change the floor plates. So it means that you don't just have to design a building that will be there for 20 years and it won't change its function, that you're actually designing buildings where you can move the floor plates around and do things. So Argent, one of the developers who was responsible for the King's Cross and redevelopment, they're now moving into flexible spaces as well. And we've been working with them on these adaptable spaces and modular spaces, and it's really exciting because it means that you just get to reimagine spaces without having to put in huge investment as well. Number 8, use big data and data analytics to design what our users really want. So one of the things that is really critical, we've now got lots of data at the moment, but we need to use analytics to work out what does the data mean and how is it going to make our towns and cities function better, and how will it make it more efficient, and how do we use it properly. So, and using real data about individual behaviours, and it opens up whole new ways of doing things. And there's all these different things like big data, cloud computing, the data lakes, data harvesters. What does it all mean? It's all about looking at how do you link it back to you as a person, and then you as a city, and then what you're trying to do. This is just one of the examples of something that we worked on in Melbourne, where we had a lot of data, and we did trials with Melbourne University, and we worked out how people would move, and we could make a whole lot of recommendations, and also had a much better understanding about how people made mode choice. One of the other things that we also are doing at the moment with the Ministry of Transport is we are now doing, we're developing a model for the whole country called Agentbased modelling, and that is all about how do you, it's about modelling people rather than making assumptions about land use or other things and then just taking it, putting it into a model, and then by the time the model's done its run that it's out of date. The agent-based modelling is something that we're doing in New Zealand and in Ireland and the UK at the moment, and it's about, and you can do runs to work out different options for transport, but also linked in with land use over 24 hours rather than over 3 months. But things don't have to be complicated. Even simple tools can help, and you can see there, and they've got this in Auckland and in other places around the world. That's just a simple measurement of numbers of bikes coming through. So number 9, cities need to work collaboratively and move into a much more proactive and integrated strategic role. So one of the most critical things, and people think, oh, it's easy, but it's not, and what Dave talked about it earlier, is people have got to work together, right? But not just at grassroots level. We've got to work together as politicians, as practitioners, as just people, to actually try and get a shared vision and then work together on solving problems. And if we can do that, then we can actually start to harness a lot of the different technologies and models that are out there for good. But we've got to make sure that that all of these things have got a strong vision and they're outcome led, so that we make sure that we are not chasing red herrings and that we can move towards a really strong future. And so finally, the other things that we've got to do is we've got to co-create with iwi and the public. I think New Zealand's one of the luckiest countries in the world because of our Indigenous people. It's really given us a way to look at things differently, and we've got to actually work together much more, not just about add-on with iwi and add-on it and with the public. It's about true partnership. It's not really about this, and I know I'll probably hurt someone's feelings in the room, but people look at this. If you get this through your letterbox, and some people go cross-eyed. They think you're trying to hide stuff from them. It's all about trying to see what we can do collaboratively and properly engage with people, and actually be committed to a collective vision and early engagement and partnership working. It's not about lip service, because it might take a bit longer at the start, but your outcomes will be way better, and people will want to own it together. And the ideas that you can bring in together, working in partnership, will be huge, and the change that you can make in your community, and also your getting your visioning for the future once you've had that successful project and program will be huge. And then things like trying to find tools where you can actually reach out to everyone, because, and we've seen this with the last COVID outbreak in Auckland, is that the government wasn't able to reach out to everyone because everyone communicates differently. And so one of the things you need is a whole toolbox of how can you engage. This is some of the 3D goggles that are sometimes used with engagement. We have a virtual train that we use at our company where people sit on, and we also have one for discovering places from a children's perspective. There's all sorts of different things you can do, but it's about there's no one-stop shop, one excellent way of doing it. It's about trying to get a mixture of things that you can properly reach out to people and get a way to engage with people, but also that's in addition to partnership. But creating that stronger support and better solutions by designing jointly by the public and iwi, you'll get much better solutions. This is an example in the Netherlands actually of a cycleway that cuts across a motorway. But there's so many different things you could do, but we are better together. And I don't mean to sound like Jacinda, because but it is, we are much better together. But it's just about taking that time and making sure you've actually put that into your projects as well. So in summary, we need to put our outcomes at the heart of our design. We've got to embed progressive measures within large capital projects. So it's not about doing the same old. It's about challenging things and making sure that you are achieving your outcomes as you go. Some of the large capital programs around the world and in New Zealand, currently they divert off and suddenly they haven't achieved any of the outcomes that they were supposed to do, but they're just keeping going. Some people would say transmission gully is a bit like that. I shouldn't say that, but you've got to keep looking back at what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve. Develop a better evidence base on the wider impacts of transport. Dave mentioned that right at the start. The health impacts, the wellbeing impacts. Look at all the different things that you can try and leverage off. Speak to your DHB, because they're probably trying to do some of the same things you're trying to do. Use burning platforms and climate change. Find those champions in the community. Include iconic interventions as well, so people can be inspired and show how it all fits into the bigger picture of what you're trying to do in Palmy. Design more temporary infrastructure. You guys are great at it, so keep going. It's like, keep trying to do that, but doing it in an integrated way. But design flexible and adaptable infrastructure, so if something happens, that things can be moved or moved around, and you can reshape or recycle or reuse, And that, in terms of a sustainable and restorative future, is going to become more and more important about reusing materials that are already in the public domain. Use big data and data analytics to design for what our users really want as well. Make sure that you're not just sitting back on the traffic data that is really easy to get. Try and work out what else you can get to find out what's really happening on the ground, because you'll see that some things are definitely not as what they seem. Cities need to move into a more collaborative, proactive and strategic role. So this is one of the things that Charles said in the Creative Cities thing about Palmerston North as well, that the more that you can collaborate and work together, right from governance level down to officer level, the more that you'll be successful as a city. And again, finally, and one of the most important is keep trying to partner and co-create with iwi and the public and shout about success. You know, we're in this together. It's not about one organisation or one group of people that is most important. To really get a successful city in terms of being healthy and place-based, but also still allowing movement, you've got to bring people with you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Liz. Appreciate all your attendance tonight, and thank you, Liz, for coming down and giving us another perspective. And I look forward to seeing you all in May, ready to listen to our next conversation. Thank you.